have Secretary James LeBlanc and Undersecretary Thomas Bickham here with me today to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Blair. And Secretary LeBlanc, Tom, thank you all for being here. You're welcome to make any opening comments, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you for having us today. I do have a few comments I'd like to share with you guys, and then we'll open it up for any questions you might have. First of all, I want to recognize the almost 4,400 staff in the department for the work they do. Their work is not easy and can be very stressful, to say the least. We ask them to work on a daily basis with a population of individuals who have demonstrated poor decision-making, some of which have lived sordid and dangerous lives, while others, for the first time, facing the life challenges without the dependence of illegal substances and family support. And then there are some that facing personal consequences from bad choices they've made. We ask our staff to face day in and day out working with and providing care for these individuals in a very difficult environment. This includes the loss of individuals in our custody and care and on supervision, deaths ranging from natural causes, suicides, overdoses, violence, and accidents. Just over the last 2 weeks, we had shots fired at 3 of our probation and parole officers working on warrant at 3 a.m. in the morning. Regardless of the reasons that individuals are in our custody or on our supervision, we expect D.O.C. staff to guide them to make better choices and better decisions that lead to a road of recovery, to rehabilitate them. We expect them to report to work every day and model successful behavior to connect individuals to the resources they need and to hold individuals accountable when they miss the target, to put it politely. We always need prisons. We will always need prisons, but our staff are challenged to help those who are ready to help themselves. D.O.C. staff are passionate about this work. They understand that it is critical to change the trajectory of both those incarcerated and those on supervision to make our prisons and our communities safer. For the work they do, the risks they take, the care they give, I want to publicly say thank you to them for making a difference as a member of the D.O.C. team. You, the legislature, and our Civil Service Commission have shown support to our staff and our staff needs. And while we are grateful, I must admit we continue to chase our counterparts in law enforcement locally and in corrections nationally when it comes to pay. And it shows in our recruitment and retention numbers. In January of 2016, the department had a total of 4,971 budgeted TO positions, and we started this year with 4,967 TOs. We have been able to maintain our TO, but we have had extreme difficulty filling positions, and many areas of our operations are operating at a minimum staffing levels with the use of overtime. As noted, as you saw in the budget presentation, we've gone from $7.7 million in 2013 to $40.6 million in 2021, and I believe 23 is looking a little better than 22, about $4 million better. We currently have 528 vacancies, 60 nursing vacancies, and 40 P&P officer vacancies. This is an improvement in the security area of 278 from the 806 vacancies we had in this past July. To address the lack of interest in corrections careers, we have, with your support, been able to implement pay adjustments to almost all of our critical vacancies and turnover areas. This includes special interest rates adjustments for our P&P officers, correctional officers, nurses, and our mental health staff. We are now having correctional officers with the anticipation of earning up to $41,000 a year their first year, and we are also battling competing salaries in the labor market. Our correctional directors in southern states report they are facing the same issues. Alabama recently addressed this plan that provides starting salaries at $55,855 at maximum security units, $53,245 at medium security units, which was the result of DOJ investigation into understaffed prisons in Alabama and the struggles they face with recruitment and retention. We have adopted major emphasis on staff wellness and taking care of our frontline staff and changing our training academy from 2 weeks to 6 weeks to better prepare for the job assignment. Protecting public safety. I recognize there are different opinions about the methods for providing for and improving public safety to our citizens, but I wanted to take a moment this morning to talk about the progress we have seen over the past several years. In spite of 2 years of COVID lockdown in which we lost 8 employees and 38 prisoners, first, I think we can agree that what we were doing was not working. In 2012, our prison population peaked at nearly 42,000 prisoners in custody, and our community supervision caseloads were over 72,000 in 2017. Our incarceration rate was higher than any other state, any other country for that matter, and it was twice the national average. Yet Louisiana's crime rates were still in the top 10 in all major categories, and in some cases we were number one, leading the country in crime. What we were doing was not working. Just look at the data. While we had built reentry and education programs, we were just touching the tip of the iceberg, connecting releasing individuals with services. And that work was only a function of state prisons, which made up the least amount of releases in our custody. The vast majority of our annual state prison intakes and releases from custody are being held and released from our local parish jails. This was a complete lack of programming and services available at the local level, and we're paying our share of partners just enough to house and feed the overflow of state prisons over capacity. We had to find a way to improve services to those housed at the local level. I always like to remind you of the extreme challenges of our unique situation in Louisiana, where 50% of our state, actually over 50% of our state prison population, is housed at 85 local jails and account for 88% of the discharges to our community. In 2021, 11,000 discharges were from the local level of the 13,000 that discharged. No other state houses state prisoners at the local level to this degree. Change with the purpose. Under the governor's leadership and with your bipartisan support, Louisiana implemented historical criminal justice reform efforts through a justice reinvestment initiative that you heard just a little bit about this morning with the juvenile sector, that built upon the reentry approach to improve public safety in our state. And while I'll agree there are areas that need to be tweaked, such as fentanyl crimes, I also urge that we must continue to press forward in building upon the reform to improve our criminal justice system. The 2017 JRI package addressed 4 major goals through 10 legislative instruments. First was focusing prison beds on the serious offenders and not just those we're mad at. Currently, the prison population has moved from 45.1% to 66.3% for violent offenders, while those incarcerated for nonviolent offenses have declined from 54.9 to 33.7. Second, strengthening our community supervision. We have worked hard on that and reducing that population and making our caseloads have gone from roughly 140 to 92. Fourth, and of course, clearing away barriers to successful reentry and employment, mental health, and medical follow-up, those things that make a big difference when people are leaving our system. Fourth, and what I think is very important, in reinvesting the savings into recidivism reduction, crime victim support to assist in building a sound foundation for our criminal justice system. Since we implemented the reform legislation, we have reduced our state prison population to 27,203, which equates to a 32% reduction, and has allowed us to focus those prisoners that need the most attention. We exceeded projections for reducing incarceration in Louisiana and currently rank number 2 nationally in incarceration rate, second to Mississippi. While coming in second to last is not often a place to be proud of, it does mean that we are moving the needle. We've seen a 35% reduction in our community supervision population, which is 45,735 today, which means our officers have the capacity to spend extra time, again, with those that most need it. Which we are currently beginning to see the increase. I would mention we are currently seeing an increase as a rebound from COVID. Our prison population has gone from a low of 26,400 to 27,500, and our PNP population is up approximately 1,900 over the last fiscal year. We're seeing reductions in recidivism, overall reduction 5-year recidivism from the highest level of 49% to 40.3%, a 17.8% reduction in recidivism. Our total population recidivism is 40.3%. Our state prison 5-year recidivism is 35.3%. Local jail 5-year recidivism is 43.3%. That's an 22.7 increase in recidivism for those discharging out of our local jail. This is where we can see our biggest opportunity for improvement. And I will also note, and I think this is important to realize, in PNP completions, if we get somebody off of the parole, the recidivism, 5-year recidivism is 14.1%. Virtually, they do not come back. As noted in the presentation, the legislation required investment of 70% each year to changing our course. That is what is driving our foundation for improvement. Over the first 5 years post-reform, and as of June 30, 22, we saved approximately $37.8 million. We reinvested 70% of the savings back into program and services to support the goal of improving public safety and helping our victims, and the other 30% have gone back to the state general fund, which includes $11.4 million to the general fund, $5.1 million to OJJ, which is the statewide diversion programs you heard about this morning, $6.4 million to community grants, funding to community organizations in 5 Tier 1 parishes and 8 Tier 2 parishes, those which make up 67% of all prison intakes in our state for wraparound services. Louisiana Parole Project, United Way of Northwest Louisiana, Goodwill Industries of South Louisiana, Volunteers of America, to name just a few of the 31 contracts we've provided. In addition to specialty courts, drug court, reentry court, mental health court, veteran courts, we've invested in those. $4.3 million in crime victims and Capital Area Family Justice Center, Crime Victims Reparation Fund, Domestic Violence Housing Assistance, Crime Lab funding, Judicial District Courts, Victim Assistant Coordinators to help PMP with pre-parole victim services. And then $10.7 million went to D.O.C. In local jails, we have begun to set up programs and services in local jails with increased programs and staff, yet there is still a major need for continued improvement at that level. We now have 22 transition specialists in 35 local jails, program development in parenting, substance use treatment, 100 hours of pre-release, IDs, residential plans, and setting up medical enrollment, to name just a few. HISET programs in 27 local jails, expand and enhance educational programs statewide to include 64 industry-based certifications in 20 local jails, college degree programs in 8 local jails, and preparing to enhance these opportunities through Pell Grants with LCTCS that begin in July of this year. 10 regional local level reentry centers for those returning to Tier 1 and Tier 2 parishes, which again is 67% of our prison population. Modernization of pre-release programs with national roadmap curriculum, workforce portal and employment initiatives through ATLO, 211 partnership and Unite Us, connecting individuals to the communities when they're released. And we've added a reception center at Raymond LaBorde Correctional Center. Not beds, program space to provide additional reception for those housed at the local level. And when combined these services we now offer in our state prisons, we offer today providing more opportunity for those that are returning to our community better than they were when they were convicted. Education, physical health, mental health, employability, IDs, transportation, and all those little things that make a big difference. And of course, decision-making skills, soft skills. Our probation and parole division, we've invested in 10-day reporting centers in regions of our state, standardized sanction grids to make it consistent across the board, focusing on staff development and training around best practices, placing 15 program manager district officers to assist in coordinating the services for those entering supervision, awarding earned compliance credits for those who do well, and taking credits for those who do not. Investing in community resources to support individuals who have needs around employment, health services, housing, and transportation, assigning victim coordinators in 8 of our probation and parole districts, emergency housing, transportation, Medicaid services, mental health, substance use disorder treatment. We have been able to invest in developing a sound foundation for criminal justice reform to improve public safety in our state. Combined with the work to address our state's education and poverty levels, common indicators of crime, agencies must work together to address crime drives for our continued public safety improvements. Looking ahead, what are our priorities? Recruitment and retention, continue to focus on a stable professional workforce to implement our mission and vision. Staff training, staff wellness, making sure all staff have equal opportunities to contribute to our agency work. Youthful offender and young adult programs, the importance of looking at our youthful and young adult populations and addressing their unique needs and complexities, who, as we all know, is a major contributor to the violent crime that is going on in our state and around the country. We are repurposing 150 beds at Hunt Correctional Center for that purpose. Aging population, 4,229 lifers, and 1,024 we are purposing beds for in our facilities for our older population. The 1,024 are actually those that have sentences longer than their life expectancy. So you're talking about 5,250 or so that are expected to die while they're in prison. Continued JRI implementation, our goals to reduce incarceration and recidivism are ongoing, especially as it relates to our partnership with our sheriffs. Cypress development, that's our new case management system, will be robust, improving effectiveness and efficiency in data-informed decision-making. Implementation of Note-Actic, a tablet-based technology for our correctional officers that will initially replace paper logbooks, track all required rounds, and track out-of-cell time in our cell block areas. Deploying standards for use of body cameras and tasers. Continued support of crime victims with victim assistant coordinators in our P&P division. Modernization of our females with the construction of a new women's facility and updated policy practice that is gender-specific, which is scheduled to be completed in January of 2025. Expansion of medication-assisted therapy, MAT, for substance use disorder treatment, which obviously is involved in opioid addiction. Restrictive housing redesign, continue to work on restrictive housing, segregation, as most of you know, on the usage and policies as it relates to mental health services for our population. Just in March of this past year, there were 150 mental health and medical transfers from our local prisons as their needs were beyond the capabilities of the local level, 150. Developing My Case module of Cypress to automate the manual decision-making in our time comp processes, and adding a FileNet solution to improve the timely submission of documentation from judges, clerks of court, and sheriffs. Partnering with the sheriffs of the implementation of SyncMD and an app approach to a portability of an individual's overall health care records upon discharge. Think of this as a My Chart for prisoners. Bottom line, better information to our communities, especially related to mental health and medical care upon discharge. Focusing on short-term offenders, reorganizing and processing of prisoners housed at the local level. Partnering with the Sheriff's Association and our sheriffs to focus on frontline or front-end reception to identify specific housing for those serving less than 1 or 2 years in custody. Short-term prisons at the local level. Another major improvement for our local level operation. As a result of House Resolution 89 of 2021 regular session, we partnered with the Louisiana Sheriffs to review over the past few months the current basic jail guidelines and find ways to improve our local operations for staff, prisoners, and their loved ones. The final rewrite of these standards will cover not only our D.O.C. population, as well as our pretrial and parish prisoners in local jails. We took research under advisement from the University of Texas at Austin Jail Policy Research Team, and we're looking at some recommendations they made in this process. Some of the topics being reviewed for updates include intake procedures, healthcare administration, security of our deputies, correctional officers, and P&P staff, visiting with families, recognizing the value of faith-based programming and working to provide more access to it, equipping individuals for success upon release, bottom line. We'll continue this work and look forward to updating you as we process. In closing, your continued support to this department and the work we are doing is very much appreciated. I'd like to close by mentioning 5 of the recently published recommendations by the Council of State Government based on research of how states can lower crime, which I thought were relevant to our criminal justice system. First, prevention. Invest in and develop a crime prevention strategy that meets local needs. For me, that means reaching out youth in high crime areas with alternative options. We are piloting this very approach in Baton Rouge by focusing on young adults with violent or gun charges on supervision. And we are preparing a young adult program at a Lane Hunt Correctional Center with 150 beds. In addition, we are doing the work that you heard about this morning with JRI investments mentioned earlier by OJJ. Second, deter crime with certain accountability. This recommendation, not about longer punishment, but about spending dollars and being consistent in accountability. The research shows that being caught deters crime more than longer punishment times. Adequately fund our law enforcement. Equip people with skills to make better choices. I've shared today how we are doing this and returning people better than we receive them. Our housing at the local level makes this a significant challenge, and we have work to do. Enlisting service agency, health, education, labor, and housing to help people address the greatest challenges upon release. We are working in partnership with the Louisiana Department of Health, the Department of Children and Family Service, Louisiana Workforce Commission, Office of Juvenile Justice, the Louisiana Sheriff's Association, the District Attorneys Association, and of course the District Judges Association to help improve public safety in our state. And last, of one I believe is our greatest challenge, improving data sharing between justice agencies. We cannot fix what we can't measure. So thanks for giving me the opportunity for about 15 minutes there to share. I know it's probably like drinking water from a fire hose there, but I didn't want to take up too much of your time. And I'd given some thought to those remarks, and I wanted to share them with you today. So I appreciate the opportunity, and we'll answer any questions you might have in regard to our budget or any other items.
Representative Villio for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning,
Morning.
Secretary LeBlanc.
Yes, ma'am.
You would agree that establishing metrics for success and assessing results is a crucial step in making informed decisions in criminal justice policy and relative to this committee funding, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And so I'm hoping through my questions, we can at least start going forward. And when I say we, I don't mean just you. I mean everyone, all the legislatures, the administration, everyone, having an honest discussion about criminal justice. So let's start talking about the stats for a minute to put things in context. I had that the high water mark for incarcerated individuals in D.O.C. was 2012, and I think you agree with that.
Yes, ma'am.
I had it at 40,000. I think you said today it was 42,000.
I think
correct?
it's 41,000. I think it's,
Sure.
it's a little above. In that-
Sure. And by the time JRI was enacted, that number had dropped to 36,000. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And then, as I understand, Pew suggested the goal was to reduce the prison population to 32,000 within 10 years. Isn't that correct?
I would take your word for it. I think that was the number.
Sure. And it's my appreciation that as of November 2022, the D.O.C. dashboard, I think that's updated, every 6 months or so?
Yes, ma'am.
But the D.O.C. dashboard had that number down to 27,000, correct?
Correct.
So by those numbers, the state's far exceeded its anticipated goal of prison population reduction. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, all the talk about Louisiana's high incarceration rates and lengthy sentences, and reviewing some of the data from the dashboard, it's my understanding that the average length of time served by an inmate is less than 15% of his sentence. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if it's 15, to be honest with you.
Okay, fair enough. Maybe if you can look at that for
Yes,
me
ma'am.
at
I'll
some
be
point
glad to. I'm sure.
and let me go. My appreciation, let me know, my appreciation from looking at the dashboard was the average was about 15%.
Spending an average of 15% of their sentence?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And nonviolent offenders, no matter if it's their first felony conviction or their 10th, are eligible for parole at 25% of their sentence, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, you would agree, and I think you talked about it, and we'll talk about it a little later, about the short-termers, but most roll out of parish jail so that they never make it into D.O.C. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. But I mean, that's not because of their sentence length. That's just because they don't. I mean, we have people that are doing 15 and 20 years in parish jails.
Okay.
So some may get to it, some may not, just depending on, if they have medical issues or mental health issues. So that's kind of where they end up with those.
But if we look at the nonviolent offenders, and particularly those who are on their third plus felony conviction, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh, a lot of those are still not making it into D.O.C.
Ma'am, they're not.
And so they're not benefiting from the very programs JRI is designed to assist in preventing recidivism. Isn't that correct?
Well, no, not because we are invested in we have 20, I mentioned that, we have 27 transition specialists in local jails. We have reentry centers now just for the local jails. There's 10 of them. So that there are, but to give you an example, I'm throwing numbers from memory, is that we discharge approximately 12,000 of the 13,000, and 11 of those are discharging out of local jails. So about 6,000 of that 11,000 today are getting some exposure to reform at the local level.
And the local jails are bearing the cost of that?
No, ma'am,
reform?
that's JRR funding.
Okay.
That's all JRR funding, other than the reentry center started in 2000. When I was doing the general administration is when they started. I was allowed to, because they were earning good time, I opened up reentry centers. We opened up reentry centers before, and that was when you saw the decline in the prison population before 2017, that was those reentry centers, in my opinion, were having an impact at the local level. And that's when it started in 2012. That's when the reentry centers started.
If you can get me some specific data that I could look at, or if we can
Yes,
talk
ma'am,
about
I'd be
that.
glad to.
As I appreciate, I believe it's the dashboard, less than 1% of DOC's prison population is serving more than 30 years. Is that correct?
I would say that's pretty close.
And in fact, the average time served by a violent offender is less than 6 years. True?
I would say so. I think, yeah, I believe it is 5-point-something years, if I remember right. I don't have that
I think
in
it's
front of me.
5.9.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this past fall, Pew released its report touting the success of the Justice Reform Initiative and certainly the administration. And I see media reports, and you've talked about that as well, correct?
Yeah.
Now, according to Pew's report, more than $100 billion has been reinvested to support victims and prevent reoffending. Is that correct?
That's correct. Over the, what has it been, 4 years, 5 years?
And by the summer of 2022, as I understand, $153 million was saved by releasing prisoners.
Yes, ma'am.
And I use that term saved. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Now, $17.7 million went to support victims,
Yes, I think so.
and $70.8 was used to address reentry and reduce recidivism, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So $70.8 million for the
70.8 million.
for the reoffending portion.
That's
Which I
correct.
think was your fourth category of the goals of JRI. To be clear, when we say savings, it's not a savings to taxpayers because the lion's share stays completely within D.O.C. Is that correct?
It's, well, 70% of it does. 70% stays in deals, allocated out to different agencies, but
Sure.
yes.
And
The
then
30% goes back to the general fund.
30% to the
Right.
general fund,
Yes,
correct?
ma'am.
Now, for purposes of performance measure, how do you define recidivism?
After 5 years.
Well-
It's a 5-year recidivism rate. In other words, if you return to prison.
Yeah.
In
So,
5 years.
so the definition of recidivism for purposes of the analysis of the data as it relates to JRI is that the individual has to return to D.O.C. custody,
Yes,
correct?
ma'am. To either in the local level or state level, right?
So let's talk about that. It's true that under JRI, revoking an individual for probation violation is much harder after JRI, correct?
I don't know that it's any harder. I mean, I don't,
Doesn't it, my understanding is they can't be revoked for less than 4 technical violations now.
that's the first I've heard of that.
Okay. And when we say technical violations, that means absconding, testing positive for drugs, conviction of misdemeanor, correct?
I would think that's in the ballpark, yeah.
And if we look at the data from DOC, it actually shows a 50% reduction in probation revocations, does it not?
Yes, ma'am.
So that would bear out that it's harder to revoke, don't you think?
Well, that would be part of it probably, but the other part might be that they doing better and getting off probation.
Okay, we'll talk about that. So let me make sure I understand your definition of recidivism. Let's say a DOC inmate's convicted of armed robbery, serving time in DOC's release under JRI, and he goes on to commit and be convicted of a burglary. But the sentencing judge places him on probation for that new burglary conviction. The JRI performance measure, that new burglary, is not considered recidivism. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, that same individual upon release could go commit 50 new misdemeanor convictions. And the JRI performance measure does not count that as recidivism, correct?
No, ma'am, but it never has. And, you know, we've always measured recidivism before JRI in the same fashion.
Okay. But I just want,
Yeah.
I don't know that the public
Yeah.
understands that. So what I'm saying is we're not, by measuring that way, we're not tracking the impact on society of the releases when we use that limited definition of recidivism. And then the question becomes that $70 million that's gone towards the reoffending piece, is that really an effective use of that money? But we'll look at a couple of more numbers, and maybe you can help me with that. You've seen the reoffending data accumulated from the district attorney's office across the state for the 5 years since JRI, have you not?
I have occasionally, yes.
Okay. My understanding is they made that data available to your office.
LCLE puts out the report on, that's what I look at.
And when this committee looks at funding, you would agree that all the data is important so that we can make meaningful decisions about funding, would you not?
Sure.
And as I appreciated, as a result of JRI, on November 1st, 2017, 1,948 inmates were released from custody. Does that sound correct?
Say that again?
1,948 inmates were released from custody initially in 2017.
Were released from custody, 1,900, I'm not,
1,948.
Those, as a result of that, when everything went into effect on November 1st, there were 1,943 immediate releases.
Okay, 1,943.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
I apologize, I was 5 off. I had 1,948.
well, I thought you were talking about since then. You're talking about on that day.
On that day, yes, sir. And 5 years later, as of October 31st, 2022, 55% of that 1,943 have been rearrested. You're familiar with those stats, correct?
No, ma'am, I'm not.
Okay. Did you review the DAs
No, ma'am.
across the state? Okay, so you're not familiar with that?
No.
You would have no reason to disagree with me if I told you that's the data they provided, correct?
No, ma'am.
And in fact, in that 5-year period, there were 2,445 arrest events of those same individuals. Are you aware of that?
No, ma'am.
And certainly, I think you would understand, I know you understand, that those are not charges that, in fact, those arrests could equate to about 10,000 actual charges. You would agree, right?
If you say so.
5 years later, as of October 31st, 2022, 1/3 of those released had been rearrested for violent crimes and sex offenses. You're aware of that, correct?
No, ma'am.
But you
What
wouldn't
report is that?
That's the DA's stats across the state for the 5 years since JRI was enacted. Now, it's clear from your statements that you agree that a 5-year recidivism data is the industry standard for measuring recidivism.
It's usually 3 years. We use 5.
You use 5, okay. And in fact, your own charts are set up for 5 years.
Correct.
Correct. Now, I've heard the administration say that since JRI, recidivism has reduced by 26%. You've heard that, correct?
Not 26, 17%.
Well, I heard you say that
I
today.
just said, it went from 40, whatever it was, 49 to 40.3, which is a 17.8% decrease. That was the high of 49, was where we were.
But up to today, I've heard the governor, and there's been presentations to suggest that the reduction was actually 26%, and the media has picked that up. You're familiar with the governor's presentation, that there was a 26% reduction in recidivism since JRI, correct?
I'm not familiar with that number, no.
Okay. Because, and I can tell you, I struggled with finding that 26%. And maybe you can help me, as soon as I talk about that, maybe we can pivot to, you said it was a 17.8% reduction. Because the way I found the 26% is the first year return from 2016 of 15.3%, and that's coming from the chart from D.O.C. Recidivism in adult corrections was measured against the first year return in 2020 of 11.3%. And to the average person looking at those numbers, you would think, well, that's a 4% reduction, right? Yet what has been touted is that that's a 26% improvement. So my question to you
I
is,
mean, it's 4%. The 4%, if you take and divide back in, I mean, it's a 20-something% reduction.
yeah, it's special math to me, is what it is. It sounds good, but at any rate, that was based on 1 year return from 2016 and 1 year return from 2020. And you would agree that that would not be the benchmark that we would look to measure for purposes of reduction in recidivism from
would agree.
JRI.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. And when you talk about a 17.8% reduction, I heard you say, I thought you said a 22.7% increase. And I'm not sure, what was the
difference
22.7
between
increase?
Recidivism rate at a state level prison is 35.3. I'd have to refer to my notes. And then the recidivism rate for someone discharging out of a local jail is roughly 43%. So that's a 22% increase in recidivism when they discharge out of these local jails. That's not anything unusual. I mean, you would expect that, other than the fact that you would expect the people at the local level would be doing better when they get out, because that's we're getting the people that have the bigger problems, the higher risk.
Now tell me about your 17.8% reduction. What years were you measuring? What year returns were you measuring against to get your 17.8?
It's the current 5-year recidivism. It's the current one that we have. I don't know what the effective date of that was.
And
I had
because
them
of,
run the numbers.
okay,
So
because of COVID,
it would be like March, maybe.
March
February,
of
March, somewhere in that neighborhood.
2022,
2023.
2023. March 2023 against
Somewhere in that
what
neighborhood.
year's return?
Ma'am?
Against what?
5 years.
So 2018, 2017?
It would be in that neighborhood, 2018.
Okay. If you could get me those percentages
Sure.
for the years that you measured.
Yeah, I'll give you the same sheet that you're looking at there.
Because going back to the 26% reduction that's been touted, not by you today, but
Okay.
prior to today, that's been touted, that 2020 year, first year returns that was used, you would agree 2020 was an unusual year as it relates to criminal justice, correct?
Yes, ma'am. And we took that into account in the JRI. We took the COVID into account.
Sure, and that wasn't taken into account when publicly it was said that there was a 26% reduction, because in fact the admissions to D.O.C. were very low, and the dashboard reflects that, very low in that year, were they not?
Obviously everything had been shut down.
Sure, trials weren't being had, and therefore, based on your definition of recidivism or JRI's definition of recidivism, people weren't being returned to D.O.C. custody because they weren't being tried and convicted, correct?
Correct.
Now, let's talk briefly about, you indicated that the probation supervision population has reduced, which is a positive because that presumably yields a more manageable caseload for officers, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think you used the total of, I think they fell from about 140 per officer to 92 per officer. And the focus of JRI effort, or one of the focuses, was to allow probation officers more time to focus on the beginning of a person's sentence, when research shows that that's probably the time that they're most likely to violate their conditions of their supervision. Is that true?
Ms. Tripp?
It's my understanding, is that happening in practice? That the probation officers are spending more time with, that's okay. I'm good. It's just a little spot and I'm used to spilling. Is that what's happening in practice, or are those probation officers actually being deployed to other services, for instance, being deployed to OJJ facilities or being deployed, thank you, to sit with D.O.C. inmates in hospitals?
Yes, ma'am. They're doing that on overtime. But it's a distraction. I'm not,
Sure.
but it's a public safety issue. When we have 800, almost 1,000 at one point in time correctional officers. And of course, the issue on the juvenile side, we just didn't have much choice.
Oh, no, I don't disagree. And
But I mean,
certainly,
that's a temporary thing. I mean, I think, hopefully, we're working on the hospital sits with the increase in staffing, and hopefully get them off of that.
but if we're looking at the JRI initiative and we're looking at, and when we sit and talk about the success of reducing those caseloads as it relates to JRI, the goal would be to help to bring the recidivism numbers down. And they're not necessarily getting a lighter caseload if they're being redeployed, say 50% of the time to work on OJJ or DOC inmates sitting in hospitals, correct?
Correct, but they're not, it's not 50% is an exaggeration. It's not 50% of their time.
What do you believe? the
I mean,
time is?
I mean, they maybe once every 2 weeks.
Okay. Do we have some stats that we could
Ma'am,
look at
I
for
can
that?
give you the stats.
Because if you talk to individuals in the field, across the board in the state,
Yes, ma'am.
that's the information. And
Well,
so-
I just visited 4 district offices, and it depends on what district you're at and who you talk to about
Okay.
that.
If we could look at that data, I'd appreciate that. And since you offered to spend some time with me this session, we can look at all of that, and I'd be happy to.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, in looking at the Louisiana Justice Reinvestment Reform's 2022 Annual Performance Report, on page 42 of the report, as I appreciate it, it shows that possession of firearms by convicted felons has doubled since JRI. Would you agree with that?
I would.
And would you agree that every year the number of inmates admitted to D.O.C. have 3 to 5 felony convictions, that being nonviolent offenders? Would you agree with that?
If that's what it says, I would.
I believe
agree
it's
with
about a third of the population. And I even think in your statement, you might have said, I could be wrong, but I thought you actually said,
it. I mentioned the gun charges that we're working with in East Baton Rouge on a
okay.
pilot.
Because it's certainly my appreciation that a third of the prison population includes nonviolent offenders that have 3 or more felony convictions. If you could check that for
I
me.
will.
And my point there, because I do believe I'm right, is that the $70 million spent in that time period on that fourth goal of yours or of JRI of addressing the offending did nothing to reach that population that have 3 or more nonviolent felony offenses. Wouldn't you agree?
No, ma'am, I'm not sure if I would agree with that without looking at the numbers.
Okay, but if you look at the numbers and we get together and you agree with me that it's a third of the population, then you would agree that the $70 million didn't reach those individuals because the very, very initiative of releasing nonviolent offenders and making sure that they don't reoffend is not happening if a third of the population has 3 or more nonviolent felony offenses.
Well, but it may have been 2/3 if we hadn't done what we've done. So, I mean, it depends on how you look at it.
Well, I think I've looked at the data, and I believe it's consistently been at least a third.
Okay, over time.
And maybe we can discuss some of this when y'all are together too.
Sure.
That's really-
Sure. I'm about finished, Mr. Chair, but if you give me a little leeway. And you talked about short-term prisoners, and you talked about working with the sheriffs on those short-term prisoners.
Proposing. I haven't, that's not, not anything
Understand.
we've done yet. That's on my plans to do.
And would that be to pretty much duplicate the programs or services JRI is funding in D.O.C.? Would that be the
It would
the goal
actually,
of that?
basically, it would be more taking a local facility and converting it into a short-term prison, which would be equivalent to a state prison. That's what I'm trying to do. Now, the funding is not, I don't have the funding to do that at this point. This is something that I'll have to do and plan and request the funding to do it. But that's what would have to be done. It wouldn't be JRI money.
And,
We don't have any more JRI that I'm aware of.
and would that be to address the nonviolent offender population?
It would be 1 to 2 years. If you have less than 2 years, then you get diverted to this program.
And why wouldn't we just give those individuals a slightly increased sentence, reduce the parole eligibility, in order that they could benefit from the programs in D.O.C. rather than burdening the taxpayers with a duplicate program in the parish jails?
Well, because they would be in the parish jail, first of all, and they wouldn't have access to programming. I mean, in other words, if you increase the population at the local level with no more programming, then they're not going to get programming, period, if they're there for 4 years.
Sure, that's my point.
Yeah.
Is if you reduce the good time formula and increased the parole eligibility and allowed them to benefit from the programs in D.O.C., then you wouldn't be
When you say in
duplicating that
D.O.C.,
funding.
I'm not sure if I understand when you say in,
In the custody of D.O.C., where you
talking about
have
at
the
the state prison level?
at the state prison, where you have the programs from JRI to address that very population. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
And we have programs at the local level too. I mean, it's not just at state prisons. We've opened up programs at the local level. And just pushing more into we don't, I mean, the turnover at the state, in other words, there's 13,000 discharges a year. I've said that earlier, 11,000 are out of our parish jail. We only discharge 2,000 a year out of our state prisons because of the time they have to do.
Just seems like it would be a better use of the funding you have, Mr. LeBlanc, if Secretary LeBlanc, if we use that funding to address that very population that JRI is intended to in D.O.C. custody for a longer period of time, so that they could benefit from the very programs JRI is designed without having to duplicate it elsewhere. Thank you, Secretary LeBlanc.
understand what you're saying.
I
Thank you.
appreciate it, Mr. Chair.